hear you, Brian.
Hey, I guess we're on the air.
The lights have come on. Here we are.
Yeah, ready to be on stage here at the MCTV studios in downtown Manchester for the show for
still
November
digesting turkey.
28th. Yeah, it's the last Wednesday in November,
It
folks.
is.
Imagine
it
that.
seems like a long November. Thanksgiving seemed to come early. It caught me totally by surprise.
Yeah, Thanksgiving was early.
And now it's I don't know. I'm going to have a hard time.
As far as I can tell, the sun hasn't shined any day this month. But next week will be the first Wednesday in December, and I expect to be here with my good friend Lou D'Alessandro at that time, because he is with us on the first Wednesday of the month. But tonight we are going to chew over mostly some issues at the state, as our Great and General Court is now getting ready to go forth to its Organization Day. This is a new term. We have lots of new representatives elected here in the city and across the state. And we have some weighty decisions to make, electing our speaker.
New speaker.
Not a lot of mystery about
new
that.
Secretary of State.
But the Secretary of State race, we're going to want to talk about that, because that is the race of the right now that the election is over. This is the race because the electorate.
State Treasurer is
State Treasurer.
pretty settled.
Pretty settled. But
strangely enough, no one ever seems to be eager to run for that.
Yeah.
So,
How about Sergeant at Arms?
well, we had
that's often hotly contested.
We had a contest for Sergeant at Arms in our caucus, believe it or not, and a couple of the incumbent Walter Sword.
I was going to say, I believe, wasn't it Walter Sword who won the contested election? And how can you not win with a name like Sword and your job
you're
as
the
Sergeant at Arms? It's,
right.
he was born.
He's born for
born
it.
for the
He's
position.
born for that,
so.
And he's very good at the job.
He's a very charming gentleman.
Yeah.
I think the audition is what, yell roll call as loud as you can? Is that kind of the main qualification?
In any event, December 5th, which is not that many days away, I think just a week away, we will be back in Concord with momentous decisions to be made. And unbelievably but nice, we will be in a strong majority in the New Hampshire House, and I'm speaking for myself and my guest Tim Smith as part of that majority, and in the state Senate. 14-10 majority in the state Senate. Let's see, it's what is in the House?
I think
264 to 1, something like that.
No,
right?
I think it's like 230 to 170. We have a margin of about 60 seats.
60 seats, which is...
And somehow we retook the council.
And
I
the
didn't
council,
see that coming.
yeah, that was a nice big surprise, because we had. In any event, we have lots of interesting things happening, and I'm very pleased that Tim Smith, who's now ready to start his fourth term as a New Hampshire state representative, representing Manchester's West Side, is with us, and as I said to him when we were out in the room preparing for the show, I'm going to be able to call him a firebrand. He is a very progressive Democrat. This is the Progress Report, so he's in the right place. But he's a very progressive Democrat, and he's always ready to try and push the leadership toward taking the more progressive view of things. And I can't imagine he won't be continuing to do that. So, Tim, thanks for coming down and joining us. You're always provocative and interesting to have, and it's been too long. We're glad you're back with us.
Hey, glad to be here.
And, you haven't been here for quite a while, and I like to have our guests take a little opportunity to introduce themselves, tell us, why you're here in Manchester, what your background is, and why you decided to seek elective office and here for the fourth time in a row consecutively successful.
Fourth time, honestly, that still kind of blows my mind. I did not expect to get elected even once, never mind re-elected 3 times after that. My background, the super short version, as a kid before I was 10 years old, I grew up with periods of homelessness, extreme poverty. For Thanksgiving, I remember very vividly in 1988, my Thanksgiving feast was a turkey sandwich. No condiments, but it was genuine deli turkey and bread. And in order to save the money for that, my parents had to go without using the coin-op shower at the campground we lived at in a little pop-up tent for about a week and a half. in order to get the extra money, and both of them worked. You know, the 1980s weren't kind to a lot of families, my own family included.
Wow.
I was an 8-year-old kid. I didn't understand that this wasn't normal. And, you know, that continued until I was a teenager, you know, the extreme poverty. And, you know, people from that kind of a background don't usually get elected into public service. So I never expected to have the successful, you know, career in the state legislature that I've had. And that experience growing up as a child, I mean, I could talk about it for hours. It really shaped a lot of the priorities that I've set for myself and conquered, the issues that I decide to work on. And a lot of the votes I take, you know, are very heavily influenced by some of those experiences as a child.
Yeah. Well, that's really, I didn't know that, Tim. I'm really glad you shared that with us. Did your parents also make it possible for you to get higher education, or what was your educational history?
So when you go to college these days, if you're not paying for it out of pocket, just cash, you fill out a form called the FAFSA. It's the Federal Application for Student Financial Aid, I think is what the acronym stands for. And I actually had to go through a lot of hoops with the Department of Education to submit that form without my parents' information. My parents and I didn't have a good relationship after I graduated high school, and they didn't want to tell me how much money they made, and they weren't contributing anything to my college education. I was completely on my own. So I needed to get, like, you know, signed affidavits in triplicate, notarized, and all that stuff from people who knew me, my landlord, my boss, just to say that I was financially independent. In order to even apply for financial aid without my parents' assistance. Because until you're 24, the Department of Education assumes that you're coming from a nuclear family with 2.3 kids, a dog, and a car, and that your family is contributing something to your college education. Well, I didn't fit that mold, and I ended up putting myself through college completely. I'm still paying off student loans. I will be probably until I'm very old. And it's been a really interesting experience, you know, living through my 20s, putting myself through college while working full time and having to pay, you know, regular adult living on your own living expenses. I didn't have a roommate or anything like that, no assistance from the family. So times were tough until I was in my mid-30s.
Wow, wow. And what college did you attend, and what degree did you get?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Information Technology Management from Kaplan University in Davenport, Iowa.
That's a for-profit school, isn't that right?
It is.
And did you feel that the education you got there was worth the extreme efforts you had to go to obtain it?
I think having the line item on my resume has been worth the extreme efforts to obtain it. I can definitely say that having the bachelor's degree on my resume has gotten my resume to the top of the pile for some of the jobs I've applied for.
Yeah.
You know, I work in the field of information technology,
Right.
which is what I have a degree in. And a lot of people who work in this field don't have a degree in it. They have a degree in, like, mathematics or engineering, or some other tangential field in the larger technology umbrella. And where I have a 4-year degree in the exact job that I have, and, you know, the exact career I've been in for the last, you know, 15, 20 years, I think that's helped.
Well, as someone who will retire before he completes paying his student loans, I can say that it's often been a question whether it was worth the expense.
Yeah.
And your answer kind of is couched in a way that I think you're probably recognizing that too. The tail on that dog is a long one.
Yes.
That's a good phrase, Mike.
Yes.
It really is. Oh, my goodness. And are you happy with the career choice you've made? I don't want you to talk about your particular job situation, but generally, are you happy with the choice you've made to be in IT and do the kind of work you're doing?
Well, you know, I'm good at it, and they pay me. I
Who
guess.
could ask for more?
Yeah.
You know, in America, you have the right to go to work, and you know you're exercising your rights to the fullest.
Right. So I can't complain about that. You know, it's not the highest stress career field on the planet. It's a desk job in an office. You know, if you had told me when I was 20 years old that at age 38 I would have a desk job in an office without needing a second job to support myself, I probably would have thought you were a liar.
Yeah.
So I can't complain. I've done okay.
Well, with the speed that technology is advancing, is it hard to maintain your credentials in this field? And
Oh, it's very difficult.
how do you do that? Do you go to lots of conferences, seminars, webinars? How do you stay abreast of this technology as it leaps forward?
Really, I'm a nerd. I'm into the stuff in my spare time. And for anyone who works in information technology, we're expected as part of our job to keep up with the times. I set aside a small amount of time each week, during my work week to invest in
It's part of the
learning-
job.
Yeah, in keeping
And
up to
Bob,
date.
as a lawyer, you know that lawyers have to go through their continuing
Yeah.
legal education.
Yeah,
you
that's
have to
true.
keep,
You got to review
doctors have
case
to,
law that comes out.
True,
professors
doctors,
have to
yeah.
keep researching and writing.
Yeah.
That's how.
It's-
But it
it's
just
the
seems
same-
like the acceleration is perhaps greast in information
Well,
technology. I don't
that's-
know whether that's true or not.
That's true. I mean, I'll resist the urge to go off on a tangent about it, but the business world doesn't move its technology quite at the same speed as consumers at home. It took wireless gizmos a very long time to become popular in corporate office environments. Whereas, like in 2003, as soon as people discovered they could get their wireless foot massager, off of like the Sharper Image catalog, everybody had 3 of them.
Yeah.
In the business world, it took a little bit longer for that to happen. So there's always a
It's
little
a
bit
bigger capital investment. You've already invested.
and there's more risk. In adopting
What's
new
gonna
technology
change next,
quickly.
too, yeah.
because you never know what's going to turn into the next Zune. It's going to be a fad.
Still got
that goes
that
away.
Betamax I'm trying to get rid of, you know?
Right.
Back the wrong horse.
Yeah. So doing it for a living, it's actually a little easier to keep on top of it because there's more of a lead time
Okay.
before anyone's going to expect me to know about it.
Well, with this background, Tim, it strikes me as rather unique and I think altogether amazing that you have chosen to be in a volunteer job, because it's essentially a volunteer job, $100 a year.
Oh, we're making that big money.
We're making that big money, and to run successfully now 4 times consecutively, to be involved in making public policy in Concord. What made you want to do that?
Well, again, the long story short, it is the 10th anniversary of the big financial collapse on Wall Street
Yes.
a decade ago. When that happened, I wasn't really too happy about it, as a lot of people weren't. I was very jaded. I felt that my generation and generations after me were being sold out for the short-term quarterly earnings reports, of a few hedge funds down in Wall Street. And
Geez, sounds like it's still happening, though.
yeah, not much has changed, but I wanted to figure out exactly why that was happening. If my grandkids were going to be paying for those quarterly earnings reports, I wanted to know why. So I spent a significant amount of time on my own, researching how the financial industry works. I wasn't really too happy with what I discovered, learning about the ins and outs of Wall Street. I mean, it's beyond the scope of the discussion, but I could talk you through how a credit default swap works. I mean, it's really nasty stuff.
I understood that once upon a time. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's black magic that shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
It's like VX nerve gas, one of those things we wish we could uninvent. But in any case, so after I learned exactly how bad the entire world economy was just getting siphoned and skimmed off the top like a mob operation, so that this very small group of investors could, make their short-term earnings targets, I took to the streets as an Occupy protester. And
Right here in Manchester?
yeah, right here, with a local crew in Manchester.
Right.
I didn't have the budget at the time or the work availability to travel to New York. Otherwise, I would have done so. And that was my start with political activism. And at some point along the way, it dawned on me that, I could make more of an impact not only being in elected office than just being out on the picket line, but I could take what I learned in elected office and share it with the activism community to help them be more effective activists. And that's what motivated me to run for office. And I'll give you a very quick example.
Okay.
Testifying at a committee hearing in Concord, something that the 3 of us would take for granted, that politically astute watchers of the show would take for granted as something not only to do, but as something that they would know how to do. A random activist, coming from that community without any political background, without any institutional
What card
experience to the
color do I
system,
pick, you
Yeah,
know?
they wouldn't know how to find out
details.
what bills are coming up for a vote in the legislature, how to find out when the committee hearings for those bills were coming up, whether or not those committee hearings were open to public input, how to give that public input, where to show up, who to talk to, what to say. Things like that, we would take for granted. That's a very opaque world if you take a step back from, we're political insiders. If you take a step back from our experiences, it's very difficult for someone without any experience or anyone to ask to get that sort of information. So I feel a tremendous obligation coming from the activist community to share that institutional knowledge with others and help them sort of break through those opaque barriers a little bit.
Okay. Well, Brian's telling us it's time for our first break. You may recall we take a couple of breaks in this show.
Yep.
And we need them sometimes.
Sometimes we really need them. But I thank you for sharing this history, which is, I think, extremely interesting. Folks, I assume that you're all aware of our call-in number, and we'd love to hear from you. 640-3091. If you want to chat with one of our most interesting and articulate members of the General Court representing the great Queen City, we have him here. It's Representative Tim Smith, looking forward to starting his 4th term in the great and General Court, as I am.
And the agenda's wide open, too. We can talk about just
We can talk about anything. We've got some topics that we want to discuss, but we're ready to hear from you folks, and we would love to do that. So please consider that, and we'll be right back. We'll be taking a very short break, and we'll be right back with Representative Tim Smith. Hey folks, if you're just joining us, this is the Progress Report, your weekly dose of dangerous TV, edification, and we hope occasionally enlightenment as we
And by the
survey
way,
the issues affecting.
we are approaching the end of our 9th year on the air. We're
Oh, my
just
God.
a
Outstanding.
couple of weeks. We're about to mark 9 years
I mean, my
of
goodness.
consecutive, entertaining, informative television.
And no arrests. Amazing.
Well, we did run into one buzzsaw.
We've had a couple events. If we can reminisce a bit, Bob. I know you've been criminally threatened. I believe
I had
And,
actually had to call the police about a threatening call that I got from being on this show.
And I can recall getting so excited that I dropped a few words that are not acceptable on public access TV. So we had to bleep them out. My sister-in-law
And
was
then
funny.
that was your decision that we had to really acknowledge the wonders of St. Patrick's Day by drinking green beer right here.
Which resulted in beer being completely
Beer is now
banned
banned from
the studio. but
MCTV.
Look it,
we've had a few adventures.
come on.
It's a proud legacy. Proud legacy.
Yeah, and I don't even want to talk about last Halloween.
Yeah, that was pretty frightening right there, his costume. Tim, your story is compelling, and I'm so glad you shared it. But given what you've told us about and how you were really motivated by the outrages of the credit default swaps and some of the other, these bundling of mortgages and rating them as top rated when the underlying securities were
And we
squat.
haven't even gotten to the bailouts.
And we haven't got to the bailouts.
And the Bermudian swaptions.
Yeah, all that
Yeah, the
stuff that
collateralized debt
you were part of an
obligations.
outrage by, and yet you chose to run for state office. And this is mostly an issue for federal action, isn't it?
Well, I don't like to reach for things that I can't grasp.
Yeah.
And I'm very cognizant of the fact that a 32-year-old, at the time, 32 years old, annoyed activist with no money and no friends with money would not be able to run for Congress or anything like that.
I think you're selling yourself short. I think you could be a powerful candidate, but what the heck? I understand that some practical considerations.
Right.
Well, as you head back to Concord, Tim, and we're all going to be going back on December 5th, Organization Day. We're going to elect the Speaker of the House. But the big issue that everybody's going to be talking about, and there's editorials all the time in the op-eds in the paper today, one by one Democratic, so-called Democratic governor and a bunch of Republican governors endorsing Bill Gardner.
Can I jump in?
Please.
I want to just jump in. It has gotten a lot of press. It's kind of exciting to talk about. It's a rarity. It's not something that's happened before. The personalities involved are big
Well, we have
personalities.
42 years of the
who we
same
know.
incumbent.
But it's not a big deal. It is not a big deal. Number one, both candidates are absolutely capable of performing the functions of the office. So regardless of the outcome, the state of New Hampshire is going to be in fine hands. So I don't mean to argue with you, and we rarely disagree, but I see this as an exciting moment. I see it as an interesting moment, but I don't see it as an earth-shattering moment, even if the upstart Colin Van Ostern, who has raised so much money in his effort to do this, does it, because we have an institutional memory in this state that, as modern as he can make that office, I don't think he can change that office very much. And I certainly think he's capable of defending the New Hampshire primary as well as anybody else.
You want to respond to that? Or
Yeah, no, I think that there's some merit to that. There's a lot of, as you said, institutional knowledge, in the Secretary of State's office, in the career civil servant type employees that will be retained regardless of, whoever's name is on the door. Both of the candidates are functional adults who can tie their own shoes. There's no risk of, like,
You set a pretty low bar there, but okay, I'll agree with you.
I like to be generous. And as you pointed out, the whole first in the nation primary, that's state law. Anyone who's telling you that we're going to lose the first in the nation primary without Bill Gardner is lying to you, and they know that they're lying. That's what makes it a lie instead of just being wrong. They know it's wrong when they say it, and it's a lie because it's in state law. The Secretary of State will schedule the first in the nation
Now let's
primary.
give credit where it's due. Bill Gardner has been
Has done
masterful in implementing the law in a way and with timing that has been very effective.
Yeah,
we've got to
absolutely.
give him credit for that.
He has executed that requirement of the state law without getting himself in trouble. There's
Same thing, different way to put it.
And Bill Gardner has done. He's had a very illustrious career as the Secretary of State. No one can question that. Whether or not they support him this particular election cycle, any of us would be fools to think that he hasn't made an enormous contribution, to the entire operations of the state government. He's been in office longer than I've been alive. It's time for him to gracefully retire. Mm-hmm. And I say that very respectfully with no malice or ill intent.
I would say, Mike, I disagree a little bit. I think it's a fairly big deal because, for so many years, and I absolutely agree with Tim, when Bill Gardner leaves office, whether it's this year or sometime in the future, can't be too far off because he's getting old, and he will have a wonderful legacy proudly to celebrate, and he will, and it will be celebrated. I mean, he is done this office proud for years and years and years. But I think recently he's had some lapses in judgment about what he's been doing.
I couldn't agree more.
And those, I think, are quite serious. I think it was as I've said, and I've talked to Bill about this, and he's very distressed that I am not supporting him. He told me last time he was in the show, and he's graced our stage very nicely for us several times and always been a wonderful guest to have here. He said the last time, which was in January, that I had asked him if he was planning to run for re-election, and he told me he was, and I said I'd support him. And I had to tell him, Bill, I don't remember that, but I don't doubt your word on that at all. All I can say is that when that happened, we did not have an alternative appearing for you. And I think his decision to participate in the Trump Electoral Integrity Commission, he has a reason for that. It was reasonable what he did. But I think it was unwise. That's my
I,
tagline on that.
I love the man. I think he has done an admirable and an exemplary job, but I have to say that I was extremely disappointed because there's not a secretary, or was not a secretary of state in the country who had a more burnished reputation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he lent that to a Trump effort.
And that is what,
Yeah.
that he was not able to see what that was all about. I know his reasons for joining that commission. He's
They were-
discussed
they were-
them.
they were
They're-
okay.
They're fine. I don't object to those.
Yeah.
But I believe he should have seen the real reason why he was asked
Yeah.
to
And-
join that.
And I think you're exactly correct there. You know, people can have correct and honest and decent motivations that lead them to incorrect decisions.
Sometimes there are sadnesses in life, and we just
Right.
have to move through them.
And I think that's one of them. I think Bill Gardner's intentions in becoming involved in that, in being able to, he hoped, effect some sort of like positive influence on that process, was very well intentioned.
And reasonable.
And it was
That's my word.
reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it
was
stands
not
to
wise.
it stands to a logical analysis.
Yeah.
However, unfortunately, it wasn't a wise decision.
Yeah.
He didn't recognize that, frankly, it was a trap,
Yeah.
and they were just going to try and abuse his reputation, and that's what happened.
Let's talk to Phil. We are glad
We
to
have Phil on
caller.
line one.
Phil, glad you're joining us to join us with Tim Smith. We look forward to your participation. Go right ahead.
Good evening, Mike.
Hey, Phil.
Bob, Tim.
Hey,
Hey.
This is Phil. Bob, can I ask you a quick question? I was obviously listening, watching the show. Did I hear you say that you referred to John Lynch as a so-called Democratic governor?
Yeah, I guess I probably shouldn't have said that. But I'll tell you, John Lynch governed. I mean, his priority and his record is distinguished. There's no doubt about it. But he really wanted to make his name as being bipartisan. And why I said that is, you know, I ran for office for the first time in 2006. I ran against Ted Gatsas, who at the time was the president of the New Hampshire Senate. And 2006 was a great year to be a Democrat running, as it was in 2018. I was expecting to have the support of the Democratic, on the head of the ticket, John Lynch, for my campaign. I did not get that support. Expressly, it was withheld from me. And it turned out, Phil, that what happened was that Ted Gatsas and John Lynch had made a deal that John Lynch would not support the candidate opposing Ted Gatsas, and Ted Gatsas agreed not to support the candidate opposing John Lynch. Now, Gatsas got the best out of that for sure, because there was no doubt about John Lynch being reelected.
Right.
There was never any doubt about his reelection after he was first elected.
Another case of not seeing what's coming, I think.
And you know, I lost that race, Phil, by just over 300 votes out of some 17,000 votes. I
I
believe,
remember the race, believe me.
and I believe those 314 votes, which was the exact number, John Lynch had in his hip pocket. But he never endorsed me. He would never campaign with me. So, you know, I was out trying to support him.
Can I interject just for a second?
Yes.
And the reason for the call is I'll go beyond the Senate race for you.
Yep.
I had the utmost respect for you, even as a young man, maybe even before I could even vote, with your Clamshell Alliance and
Yep.
your activism
Thank you.
and your civic duty. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. You were a guy that caught my eye early on. I was like, wow, what a good guy, and heart's in the right place. But I'm at odds a bit, not even a bit, more so than a bit, with the Democratic Party, especially on the state level and the city level. And you explained yourself very well, so now I have a better understanding, so I'm glad I called. But all of a sudden now there's a contest, and, you know, the most popular governor, which you've heard many Democrats refer to him as, and jump on the bandwagon and ride his coattails, and all of a sudden that he supports Gardner, he's a so-called Democrat. So I said, maybe I heard that wrong.
Well-
But now that I get the backstory, I get it. You know, politics is a rough and tumble game. And
Yeah. And let me say, Phil, I would now regret using that phrase. John Lynch, despite what happened in my race,
Right.
He did serve the state well. I honor his service. Without him, we'd be a right to know law state right now, for example. No doubt.
You're,
Right to
you're
work.
I mean, right to
you're a
right to
gentleman.
work.
You're a gentleman for saying that.
And
if I had my
I think
way,
your criticism
you would
is
be the chairman of the state Democratic Party, and the guy sitting to your left would be the chairman of the city Democratic Party.
Oh, dear
Have
God.
all of the
for
Democrats,
that.
the real Democrats that want
Yeah.
health insurance and a higher minimum wage and things of the like, union support, we could get it going. But if and until that happens,
Yeah.
I might have some red signs in my yard.
Hang in there, Phil. Don't give up the
Phil,
ship.
Thank you
We'll-
guys for
we'll
doing your
work
show,
hard
and
not to let you
Tim,
down.
Good luck to you and your endeavors, and great job, Bob and Mike.
Thanks, Phil.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thanks for calling, and I do apologize for using that phrase. John Lynch was a true Democrat in many ways. He just wanted to be known as the most bipartisan governor we've had, and I think he may have achieved that.
There's different ways to skin a cat. You know,
Yeah.
I do think that his policies and priorities were, at heart, Democratic policies and
Yeah, they
priorities.
were.
He
They were.
certainly,
And I should not have demeaned him with that phrase. I appreciate that call very much.
and any more than we would say that Bill Gardner is not a Democrat. You know, but he is a straight down the middle, do the job Democrat. You can't tell he's a Democrat because
Yeah.
he's doing his job well. And don't misunderstand me. I want to get back to it. I was appalled, and I want to get back to our discussion about that Bill Gardner had basically offered his coat as cover to this committee whose intent was obvious, at least to me. But I don't know. You know, you said just because he's been there a long time. I'm at an age where I'm not sure I can agree with that philosophy that, sometimes it's just time to go. But I don't think that there would be any shame if Bill were not to win the Secretary of State's position right now.
No, he would go out with accolades and deserve them.
And
Yeah.
he should get a gold watch,
Yeah.
I
No, I
mean,
agree.
he's done a great job.
But there are other issues involving Bill Gardner, not just the Electoral Commission, begun with a tweet and ended with a tweet, but there is the issue of the town meetings, his fight against giving town moderators any flexibility in adjusting the time of the date of town meeting. And now we've had 2 years in a row where town meeting day was a blizzard day. And I never have heard a good reason why town moderators shouldn't have some flexibility on that. We're not talking about state elections at these meetings. We're talking about town elections.
Right.
And the third thing that Colin Van Osten is talking about, well, in addition to needing to update the office technology-wise and have an up-to-date audit.
That's a real issue. I think that we've fallen, but I think New Hampshire in general, in all areas of technological infrastructure, has fallen behind over the past years. And to single out poor Bill Gardner for being, late to the dance, I think is, it's a little rough. There's
Well,
a lot of
it's-
other departments that could use an upgrade.
I'm
in
sure
their
that's true,
technology.
but
He runs the business registrations.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
it's
very
where
important.
people go to you start businesses in New Hampshire.
No,
It's
that's the corporate division is
Important.
it's extremely important, and it's revenue for the state, and they are woefully inadequate in their infrastructure.
And
I
the
think
other
that's
thing,
inaccurate.
and there was a letter sent, I don't know if you got it, Tim, today from some of our lawyers, including Kathy Green here in the city, supporting Colin Van Osten, and they were very upset about what Bill Gardner has done in regard to trying to tighten up the domicile requirements for voting, and
Yes.
that is a concern. There may be a problem there to be fixed, but his fixes seem to be in the direction of not
Wrong direction.
protecting.
You want to open it up.
Yeah,
right.
What's your intent? Right now, as you stand here, write it down. You're good to go. In my, I oppose voter ID. I oppose, as I put it, a whiff of air in my face to prevent me from exercising that right.
Right.
Yep.
It is without a doubt.
Unlike the right to bear arms, no one gets killed when you vote.
Yeah, I mean, it is by far the most fundamental right we have in a democratic republic like this. I mean, the sanctity of the right to vote. I mean, this goes back to the Roman Senate. This is inviolate. This isn't something that you mess with. And these efforts from a very small cadre of people, whatever their intentions and motivations, which may or may not be completely nefarious, depending on who we're talking about, to give that whiff of air and have someone put their hand out in front of you is not acceptable. And I would personally be eternally happy if the Secretary of State's office didn't get involved at all in the legislative process. The Secretary of State and members of his staff have made a habit of testifying at legislative hearings, and often when they
But
testify,
never to protest the gerrymandering.
right, never to protest
the
gerrymandering.
but to protest our, maybe rejecting a change to the domicile requirements to maybe have an effect on the ability of our,
Right.
our colleges, university students to vote.
And often, when the Secretary of State's staff or himself, when they show up to testify on these bills, they're the only ones testifying on their particular side.
Yeah.
On the side of more restrictions,
And-
making
and-
it harder for people
And
to
if
vote.
people knew how deeply the committees relied upon the lobbyists, and I include the Secretary of State's office when testifying as a lobbyist, they're considered experts. They're considered the chairman of the departments. These committees are beholden to the lobbyists.
because there's no other staff, essentially, no other staff to support them.
What was I
It's a
just
problem.
saying about being woefully inadequate in infrastructure?
Yeah.
I agree completely. Pass some funding and let's fix the state of New Hampshire. We've been on a skeleton crew for 200 years.
Yeah.
Time for a break, Bob.
Time for a break.
Plus, I'm getting all worked up. I gotta calm down.
Calm down. Watch that blood pressure. We'll be right back, folks, with more with one of our most interesting public officials here in the city of Manchester.
I'll second that.
Representative Tim Smith. We're really glad he's with us, and we'll be right back. And please call in like Phil did and join us. Hey, folks, this is the progress report for this Wednesday, November 28th, the last Wednesday of the month of November. Hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday.
By the way, the election results just finally came in. Can you believe it? It's the 28th, and we're finally getting the final
from
return to the Mississippi
I
runoff.
assume the lady won.
She did.
Yeah, Mississippi's,
Mississippi is still
their-
Mississippi.
Public hanging lady.
their female Al Moore,
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if he was as
Yeah,
bad
yeah.
as.
Roy Moore.
In any
Roy
event,
Moore,
well, let's see, when did the last recounts here in New Hampshire end? Just Tuesday, I think. I
Yeah.
think that's what Bill Gardner said. He was
There were
busy
quite a
doing
few.
that.
There
And
were quite a
few, and I don't think there were any big changes except the one lady from New Boston, Donna Monbouquet, who went from down 22 to up 12.
I cannot believe that. I've sat through a couple.
I've never heard of
recounts,
a recount like that.
and that is amazing. I think. I don't know. Something's going on in New Boston. Somebody stepped away from the table, maybe. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Things
yeah.
can happen. It's a complicated process. It takes some training. I know the folks who do it here in Manchester are absolutely top notch.
Yeah.
Aside from that part of asking me for my license, everything else about it is fantastic. Yeah.
So, Tim, I think where I'd like to go next is I'd like to hear something about your legislative ideas. I'm sure you've got some good ones, at least provocative ones. And I'd like to hear about it because you were telling me some things that I thought were quite interesting about the way you think you and people who identify with you, and a good many of them are good friends of mine. I hope all of them are. Tell us a little bit what your legislative ideas are and what your strategy is.
Well, we're still kind of working on it. And when I say we in this context, I'm specifically referring to the Progressive Caucus in the House, of which I'm one of the founding members. We want to hit the ground running now that we have the state Senate for the first time in quite a while, at the same time as the state, as the House of Representatives. Really, theoretically, the only roadblock we're up against is Governor Sununu's veto.
Right.
And where we have the majority in both chambers of the legislature and the executive council.
But not override majorities.
Right. But given that the elections came down the way they did, it is very much his job to work with us. And we're going to make sure that he has to do that. Our hope is that we're going to send a pile of progressive legislation to his desk and basically force him to sign off on it if he wants to run for a third term. The voters have given the New Hampshire Democrats a clear mandate, and we better deliver.
Now, there's a provocative thought. Most of the people I'm talking
I
with,
like his
Tim,
thinking.
are not thinking that way. They're thinking, how can we craft this legislation to avoid a gubernatorial veto?
Yeah, and they're wrong. That's the complete incorrect
And
strategy.
you think
That is the triangulation strategy, and I'm so sick of it. I like the way you are talking. We are Democrats. We ran on a platform. We have to deliver that platform. Period. People
That's it.
voted for it. They want it.
And even
And
though
it
even though
pulls-
it causes a veto, which causes the bill not to become law, you think that's the way to go.
Legislation is a process. It
As
takes
does
time.
Representative Smith here.
Well,
Legislation
that's-
is a process.
That's, in my opinion, speaking not only as a legislator but as a citizen of New Hampshire, that's the beauty of the Constitution, the checks and balances in the system. I don't believe in one-party control. I want there to be voices at the table that disagree with me. As strange as that might sound for a legislator to say. I'm not necessarily saying I always want there to be, a Republican governor threatening a veto on everything we do, but the checks and balances have to function, and that's one of them. And the voters gave that particular check to the governor's office.
Well, this assumes you're extremely optimistic that we will retain these majorities or even improve on them in 2 years.
Well, if we
You
work
won't.
hard,
You won't if you don't give the people who voted for you what they sent you to Concord for.
right. See, if the governor vetoes all of our bills, we are still in the position to say, look, we did our jobs. If we don't
did
give
what you sent us to Concord
right,
to do.
if we don't give the governor any bills that, are enacting the Democratic Party platform, then we're not doing our jobs.
Well,
Because you have to remember something
all
very
right.
important.
I'm dissenting
When-
on this from you two guys.
no,
I'm dissenting on
and
this.
it's a respectful dissent. We,
And I think people want us to go there to get something done. If we pass a bunch of bills that are vetoed and we can't override the vetoes, we haven't got the job done.
well, I'm not suggesting that the only bills we work on are the progressive bills, but obviously that needs to be a piece of the pie. And I'll point out that when the Republicans are in the majority, the thought absolutely never crosses any of their minds in the legislature or
Let's reach
anything.
out and see if we can get bipartisan support for this bill.
When John Lynch and Maggie Hassan were sitting in the corner office, they never once thought we better water our agenda down to avoid that veto from John Lynch or Maggie Hassan. No, they're going full bore with all the crazy right to work nonsense, these ridiculously
Well, I
irresponsible
could argue that's
budget
why they
items.
haven't held the corner office for many years until Sununu got it 2
They
years
do
ago
now.
and got reelected.
Well, that may very well be the case, but the point is that they've been able to deliver the results within their capability. The legislature is all that they could realistically deliver on. They were able to deliver that to their base, and they were consistently rewarded for it. Now that their base stayed home and our base showed up, it's time to deliver for our base.
Okay.
That's
Well,
our job.
This is a fascinating little discussion we're having, and we have two different views here. But we have Robert on line one. Like the name. Hey, Robert, join us.
Election. I just want to go on record as saying I am 100% in favor of people having to show an ID at the polls. Okay, you can't cash a check, you can't get a job without posting some sort of positive identification, and I'm all for it. I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but there was a ballot stuffing aspect in Manchester years and years ago. I do believe it was worth $4, and I think we should do anything we can to avoid even a semblance of hanky-panky. Thank you.
I appreciate the call. I recognize that the majority of people probably agree with the caller because that is what the law is now.
Yeah.
I'm going to stay opposed to it until the day I die. I think it is an interference with the right to vote. Ballot stuffing in Manchester. I've lived in Manchester since I was born, and I don't recall any ballot stuffing issue. I do know that there have been investigation upon investigation. There have been 1 or 2 prosecutions for fraudulent voting. I think there's been as many, if not more, on the Republican side than the Democratic side. I'm willing to live with that. In order to allow more people to come in to vote and not be turned away, because if you forgot your license in your car, you might not go back in with it. You might drive away, and that is why they pass these laws.
Right.
So I'm opposed to them, and I'll forever be opposed to them. And I deserve as much respect for my opinion as the caller deserves for his opinion, and I give that respect.
Well, I'll say this to Robert. I don't think we need the voter ID, but I don't think it's a terrible burden either. I think their elections can still work okay without deterring people from voting with the voter ID requirements.
It's not the point.
Well,
The deterrent does not have to be terrible to be a deterrent.
Yeah, there are degrees of deterrence.
there are degrees of deterrence, and this is a fairly minor one. I'd rather it wasn't there because, as I've said so often on this show, the scandal in this country isn't people voting who don't have a right to vote. It's that so few people vote.
Exactly, and that's
That's the
part
scandal.
of my point. You got to do more to
Yeah, you
get them
gotta
in,
do more.
not more to keep them away.
Yep.
Fewer questions.
No,
not
I
more
got to
questions.
say though, I'm all in favor of verifying people's identities. I mean, when I had to register to vote before the voter ID stuff, I had to submit a mountain of paperwork to prove that I was who I said I was.
Yeah.
And all of that paperwork was easy to get for free. And that's the real key,
Right.
is that anyone can get that stuff, like their birth certificate, social security card. Everybody's got all that. You don't have to pay anything or jump through any special hoops to get it. I'm all in favor of having some sort of security in place to make sure that nobody's
No,
stuffing
let me
ballots.
ask you this. Why should you have to register to vote? Why shouldn't you just be allowed to vote?
Really, to make sure that people only vote once. It's
Well,
an
you got to
integrity
make sure
check.
people are a citizen and that they're the age
Right.
to vote. I mean, there are
I'm
some
throwing this out. I have not thought it through. I'm
No,
trying
it's
to
a-
be a little bit iconoclastic.
No.
There are some people that advocate birth certificate voting. You're on the voter rolls when you turn 18.
Well, then that would be a registration. It might not necessarily be a formal process, but there would be a list of eligible voters, and you'd have to get your name ticked off. That's a registration.
kind of where I'm going. I'm
Yeah.
not saying let anybody walk into any polling place and vote. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is why do we need to have a hoop to jump through? Again, why can't we make it easier? Why not when you get a driver's license, you're automatically registered to vote?
And there are states that do that. I'd love to see New Hampshire added to the list, and there will probably be legislation to that effect coming up in the next 2 years. I may or may not have already co-sponsored such a bill.
Well, I was looking into that once, and I've decided it's not a good idea. I think our same-day registration is a better alternative to this. And I don't think same-day registration works with motor voter registration. very
I
well.
agree with you on that. I do agree that we have a very good same-day voter registration.
That I-
and
that
you know
I-
why?
that
Because
I
we
wanted
don't
to
use
bet.
provisional ballots. You get a real
Yes.
ballot. and
Never
you count
use
it.
provisional ballots, and always have paper ballots. That's
Agree, 100,000%.
those are-
Since we're talking about elections, how about the idea of being able to vote for a second choice in order to make sure that a majority
Oh, the
of
ranked
people-
choice voting?
Yeah, how about that?
That's,
They do it in Maine now, and I understand that it's under some challenge by a loser,
called Governor LePage.
it's an interesting concept that I hadn't thought much about. What do
Well,
you think about
their
that?
congressional candidate who lost from the ranked choice voting is,
Yeah.
is trying to
They do it in
challenge
Ireland,
Oh, I
which
guess
means
that's right,
yeah.
I have a tendency to like it.
It's interesting. I got to tell you, a lot of my friends in the progressive community are 1,000% behind ranked choice voting. I'm only about 80% there. I have reservations in that some of the caveats in how you actually work it are prone to error and need to be handled correctly. I do not know enough about the way Maine has implemented it to know whether or not I would, agree with that particular model. I think in principle, the idea of ranked choice voting is meritable, and I'm glad that at least one state is doing it so that the other 49 can
Well, it
examine
promotes a
it.
policy of
Right.
having a majority behind the candidate
Right.
who's elected.
Right.
Which,
My reservations come from the fact that, like any public policy, it would be really easy to screw it up, to do it and do it wrong. And where it's not really a new idea, but where it's a new policy, it's not something that there's a lot of history and background in the United States to look at. I tend to be very careful about being early adopters for things like that. And that's why I said I'm so glad to see that at least one of the other states has gone first.
so the experience of, I think,
Yeah.
Australia and Ireland and the other countries that use this,
Well, it's not directly analogous because they have parliamentary systems. There are definitely lessons to be learned, but you can't just cross out New Zealand and write New Hampshire at the top of it. The principle is there, and we can learn. I think, and this is my opinion. I think we can learn from those examples that the principle is sound and that it can be done well. It can
Who knew we'd
absolutely
be talking about
done
this?
well.
But I'm glad we had the conversation. I think it's a conversation that you should keep up in the legislature.
There's already a bill for it.
Just a few quick things. Are you going to support legalization of marijuana this time?
Yes, I voted for it, I think back in my first term when it came up.
Okay.
I'm not an activist on the issue, but I do support legalization of marijuana.
Okay, I differ with you on that, but that's okay. And you mentioned some legislative initiatives you'd like to push forward, even if it meant a gubernatorial veto. Can you give us an example or two?
3 quick examples because we're getting ready to wrap up.
I'll give you the minimum wage, repealing a lot of the voter ID nonsense, and I'm looking at some legislative ethics issues, working with lobbyists and legislative administration.
Sorely needed.
That is very likely to run
weak.
into the veto pen.
It's weak in
Okay.
New Hampshire. We need to strengthen that.
Okay, well,
And I'll say as my closing thought, taking an example from some of the states down in the South that have used constitutional amendments to try and restrict people's personal reproductive health decisions in the current environment where Roe v. Wade may be overturned, I would be more than happy to see a New Hampshire constitutional amendment to protect people's reproductive health rights.
well, we may have done it with the Constitution Question 2, creating a privacy right in the New Hampshire Constitution. That's not explicitly in the federal Constitution, and it's the basis for the Roe v. Wade decision. Tim, it's fascinating to have you here. I'm so glad that you are choosing to be a public servant. I think you're provocative and thoughtful, and it's just a pleasure to have you as a colleague. And so that's going to wrap up this edition of the Progress Report.
Time flies.
Mike won't be here next week, alas.
I will be away.
But I'll be here with Senator Lou D'Alessandro, and we'll post up what we got coming up. I have some ideas with Lou, so be looking forward to us at that time. Thank you to our callers, and thank you for our viewers. We appreciate all of you, and have a great evening, folks. Take care.